The rain came down hard on Tuesday morning. Judge Margaret Whitmore sat in her expensive car, looking at the traffic ahead of her. She was already 20 minutes late for court. Her fingers tapped on the steering wheel as she watched the red brake lights in front of her. Margaret was not having a good morning. Her coffee maker broke at home. Her dry cleaning was not ready. Now this traffic was making her even more late. She looked at her watch again and made an angry noise. When she finally got to the courthouse, Margaret grabbed her briefcase and ran through the parking lot. The rain soaked her gray suit jacket. Her high heels clicked loudly on the wet pavement as she hurried to the building. The courthouse was old and grand. Tall white columns stood at the front. Inside, the floors were made of smooth marble that reflected the bright lights above. Margaret had worked in this building for 8 years. She knew every corner of it. As Margaret rushed through the front lobby, she was not paying attention to where she was going. She was thinking about her busy day ahead. 3 cases to hear, 2 meetings with lawyers, a lunch with the mayor. Her mind was full of all these things when she almost ran into someone. A man was mopping the marble floor near the entrance. He wore a dark blue uniform with his name tag that said Marcus. He was a black man, maybe in his 40s, with kind eyes and careful hands as he worked. The mop bucket sat next to him, and the floor was wet where he had just cleaned. Margaret did not see him until the last second. She tried to stop, but her shoes were slippery from the rain. She bumped into the man's arm, and some of her coffee spilled out of her travel cup. A few drops landed on her jacket and on the clean floor. "Oh," Marcus said, quickly moving his mop bucket out of the way. "I am so sorry, ma'am." "Are you hurt?" Margaret looked down at her jacket. The coffee stains were small, but they were there. She looked at the man and then at the wet floor. Her face showed she was not happy. "You should put up signs," Margaret said in a cold voice. "People need to know when floors are wet." "This is dangerous." Marcus looked confused. "Ma'am, there are signs. 3 of them." He pointed to the yellow signs around the area. They clearly said wet floor in big black letters. Margaret looked at the signs. She had not seen them because she was in such a hurry. But she did not want to say she was wrong. Instead, she made her voice sound more important. "Well, they are not big enough," she said, "and you should not be mopping when people are trying to walk here." "This is a busy time of day." Marcus nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. But I have to clean early in the morning before the courts open. It is the only time allowed." Margaret was getting more angry. The coffee stains on her jacket bothered her. Being late bothered her, and now this man was trying to explain things to her like she did not understand how the courthouse worked. "Listen," Margaret said, looking down at Marcus. "I have been working here for 8 years. I know how this place works. You people need to be more careful. Some of us have important jobs to do." The words "you people" hung in the air between them. Marcus stopped moving. His grip on the mop handle got tighter, but his face stayed calm and polite. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said quietly. "I understand you have important work. I will be more careful." Margaret was about to say something else when she heard footsteps behind her. 2 lawyers were walking toward them, both carrying briefcases and looking like they were in a hurry too. "Good morning, Your Honor," one of the lawyers said to Margaret. "Running late today?" Margaret straightened her jacket and tried to look professional again. "Just a small delay," she said, not looking back at Marcus. "I will see you both in court." As the lawyers walked past, Margaret started to leave, but then she heard Marcus speak softly. "Good morning, Your Honor," Marcus said with respect in his voice. "I hope you have a good day in court." Margaret stopped for a second. Something about the way he said it was different. His voice was educated, careful with words. But she was too busy and too angry to think about it much. "Yes, well," Margaret said without really looking at him. "Just be more careful next time." She walked away quickly, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Behind her, Marcus went back to mopping. He worked slowly and carefully like he did everything else. His movements were quiet and respectful. Margaret took the elevator to the 5th floor where her office was. As the doors closed, she thought about the man with the mop. She felt a little bad about being so harsh, but she pushed the feeling away. She had more important things to think about. In her office, Margaret tried to clean the coffee stains from her jacket with a wet paper towel. The stains were small, but they annoyed her. She looked at herself in the mirror behind her desk. Her gray hair was still neat. Her makeup was still perfect, but the stains made her feel messy. Margaret's assistant knocked on the door. "Judge Whitmore? Your first case is ready to start." "Coming," Margaret called out. She put on her black judge's robe and walked to the courtroom. As she passed through the hallways, she saw other courthouse workers. Security guards, clerks, maintenance people. She barely noticed them, just like always. The courtroom was full of people waiting for their cases to be heard. Margaret sat down at her high bench and looked out at the crowd. Lawyers, defendants, family members, court reporters. Everyone was there for justice, or at least their version of it. As Margaret called the first case, she thought about her important role. She was a judge. She made decisions that changed people's lives. She had power and respect. Not everyone could do what she did. But down in the lobby, Marcus continued mopping the floors. He worked quietly, making sure everything was clean and safe for all the people who came to the courthouse. He treated everyone with respect, even those who did not show him the same kindness. Neither Margaret nor Marcus knew that their paths would cross again very soon. And when they did, everything would change. 2 hours later, Judge Margaret Whitmore was feeling better about her day. The coffee stains on her jacket were almost dry and barely showed. Her first court case had gone smoothly. The lawyers were prepared and everything happened on time. Margaret liked being in control of her courtroom. When she spoke, everyone listened. When she made a decision, everyone accepted it. This was her world and she was good at it. The morning case was about a car accident. 2 drivers blamed each other for running a red light. Margaret listened to both sides, looked at the evidence, and made her ruling. It was clear and fair. The lawyers thanked her and left to prepare their papers. "We will take a 15-minute break," Margaret announced to the courtroom. "Please be back at 10:30 sharp." People began to leave the courtroom. Some went to get coffee or use the restroom. Others stood in the hallway to talk about their cases. Margaret stayed at her bench looking over the notes for her next case. The courtroom became quiet except for the sound of people moving around. Margaret enjoyed these peaceful moments. It gave her time to think and prepare. She was reading through a file when she heard the sound of wheels rolling across the floor. Marcus had come into the courtroom with a small cart. On it were trash bags, cleaning supplies, and a dustpan. He moved quietly, trying not to disturb anyone who was still there. He began emptying the trash cans around the room. Margaret looked up from her papers and watched him work. Marcus moved carefully between the rows of seats, picking up pieces of paper and empty coffee cups that people had left behind. He worked fast but was not sloppy. "Excuse me," Margaret called out to him. "How long will this take?" "Court starts again in 10 minutes. Marcus looked up at her. "Just a few more minutes, Your Honor. I will be done before people come back." Margaret nodded but kept watching him. She noticed how he folded each piece of trash neatly before putting it in his bag. He wiped down the armrests of chairs where people had sat. He was very thorough. Sarah Chen, the court clerk, came back into the room carrying a stack of files. She saw Margaret watching Marcus and walked over to the bench. "The Henderson case files are ready," Sarah said, setting the papers down. "Both lawyers are here and waiting." "Good," Margaret said. She looked back at Marcus, who was now working near the front of the courtroom. "Does he always clean during court breaks?" Sarah followed Margaret's gaze. "Marcus. Yes, he has a schedule. He tries to work around court times, but sometimes he has to clean when court is in session. He is very quiet about it." Margaret watched Marcus empty the trash can near the jury box. "How long has he worked here?" "About 2 years, I think," Sarah said. "He is a good worker. Never causes any problems. Always polite to everyone." Margaret made a small noise that could have meant anything. "I suppose someone has to do these jobs," she said in a voice that was not quite quiet enough. Marcus was close enough to hear her words. He paused for just a second while reaching for a piece of paper on the floor, but he did not look up. He continued working as if nothing had been said. Sarah looked a little uncomfortable. She had worked with Margaret for 3 years and knew the judge could sometimes say things without thinking about how they sounded. "Yes," Sarah said carefully. "All jobs are important here." Margaret did not seem to notice Sarah's tone. She was thinking about something else. "I wonder if these people even finished high school," she said, looking at Marcus. "I mean, this is not exactly work that requires much education, is it?" The words came out louder than Margaret meant them to. Her voice carried across the quiet courtroom. Marcus stopped moving entirely. He was holding an empty water bottle, and his hand tightened around it. Sarah looked shocked. "Judge Whitmore," she said quietly, "perhaps we should—" But Margaret was not done talking. Something about the morning's frustration was still bothering her. The traffic, the coffee stains, being late. She felt like saying what she was thinking. I mean, look at him, Margaret continued, gesturing toward Marcus. Some people are just born to clean up after others, you know? They find their level in life and stay there. Not everyone can handle the pressure of real responsibility. Margaret laughed a little at her own words. It was not a mean laugh exactly, but it was not kind either. It was the laugh of someone who thought they were being clever and funny. Marcus slowly stood up straight. He looked directly at Margaret for the first time since entering the courtroom. His eyes were calm, but there was something else there too. Something that looked like disappointment, but also like understanding. "Your Honor," Marcus said in his quiet, respectful voice, "I will finish cleaning and get out of your way." "Oh, you do not need to rush," Margaret said, still smiling. "I was just making conversation with Sarah here." "Nothing personal, you understand. We all have our place in the world." Marcus nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." "We do." He went back to his work, but something had changed. His movements were still careful and professional, but they seemed stiffer now. Like he was working hard to control himself. Sarah watched this happen with growing discomfort. She had always respected Judge Whitmore's legal skills, but this side of her was harder to watch. Sarah herself was the daughter of immigrants who had worked cleaning jobs to put her through college. Margaret's words hurt her too. "Judge," Sarah said quietly, "the lawyers are probably ready to start again." Margaret looked at her watch. "Yes, you are right. Time to get back to work." She looked at Marcus again. "Unlike some people, we cannot take all day to finish simple tasks." This time, Margaret's laugh was definitely mean. She seemed to think she was being very funny and smart. She did not notice that Sarah was not laughing with her. Marcus finished emptying the last trash can and began pushing his cart toward the door. As he passed the judge's bench, he stopped and looked up at Margaret. "Your Honor," he said, "I hope your day gets better. Sometimes when we are having a hard morning, we say things we do not really mean." "I understand that." The words were said with such genuine kindness that Margaret stopped laughing. For a moment, she felt something like shame, but she pushed the feeling away quickly. "Yes, well," Margaret said, trying to sound important again. "We all have stressful jobs. Some more than others, of course." Marcus nodded. "Of course. Have a good day, Your Honor." He pushed his cart out of the courtroom. The wheels made a soft rolling sound that grew quieter as he moved down the hallway. When the sound was gone, the courtroom felt very quiet. Sarah was organizing her files, but she was not looking at Margaret. The silence felt heavy and uncomfortable. "Well," Margaret said, trying to sound normal, "we should get ready for the next case. Are the lawyers prepared?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said. Her voice was professional, but it was cooler than usual. People began coming back into the courtroom. The break was over and it was time to get back to work. Margaret put on her reading glasses and opened the file for the next case. But as she read the legal documents, she kept thinking about the way Marcus had looked at her. There had been no anger in his eyes, just a kind of sad understanding. Like he had seen this behavior before and knew exactly what it meant. Margaret shook her head and focused on her work. She had more important things to think about than a janitor's feelings. She was a judge with real responsibilities. She made decisions that mattered. She did not know that in a few hours she would learn just how much Marcus Thompson's opinions and decisions mattered too. That evening, Judge Margaret Whitmore stood in front of her bedroom mirror, trying to decide which dress to wear. She had 3 options laid out on her bed: a navy blue dress, a black dress with small pearls, and a dark green dress that brought out her eyes. Tonight was important for Margaret's career. The State University was hosting a big fundraising dinner for their criminal justice reform initiative. All the important people would be there: judges, lawyers, professors, and wealthy donors who supported legal education. Margaret wanted to make a good impression. She was thinking about running for a higher court position next year. Events like this were perfect for meeting the right people and showing that she cared about justice and education. She chose the navy blue dress. It looked professional but not too serious. She added her pearl necklace and matching earrings. Her gray hair was styled perfectly, and her makeup was just right for evening lighting. Margaret felt good as she drove to the university. The rain had stopped and the evening was clear and cool. She practiced what she would say to people at the dinner. She wanted to sound intelligent and progressive. She wanted people to remember her as a thoughtful judge who cared about making the legal system better. The university campus was beautiful at night. Old brick buildings were lit up with warm yellow lights. Students walked along the paths between buildings. carrying backpacks and talking with friends. Margaret remembered her own college days, though that was many years ago. The dinner was being held in the university's grand ballroom. It was a large room with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and tall windows that looked out onto the campus gardens. Round tables were set with white tablecloths, fancy glasses, and fresh flowers. Margaret gave her coat to the attendant and walked into the room. She recognized several people right away. Judge Harrison from the appeals court was talking with two law professors. District Attorney Williams was laughing with a group of donors. Margaret felt comfortable in this crowd. These were her people. "Margaret," called a voice from across the room. It was Dr. Patricia Vance, the law school dean. She walked over with a big smile. "I am so glad you could make it tonight. This event is so important for our reform initiative." "I would not miss it," Margaret said, shaking Patricia's hand. "The work you are doing here is vital. We need more programs that help judges understand how to make the system more fair." Patricia looked pleased. "That is exactly what tonight is about. We are raising money to expand our research programs and create new training courses for judges and lawyers. Come, let me introduce you to some people." Patricia led Margaret around the room, making introductions. Margaret met professors, researchers, and donors. Everyone was talking about criminal justice reform, bias in the courts, and new ways to make the legal system work better for all people. Margaret enjoyed these conversations. She felt smart and important talking about these big ideas. She made sure to mention her own work as a judge and how she always tried to be fair to everyone who came to her court. "Dinner will be served in just a few minutes," Patricia announced to the room. "Please find your seats. Our keynote speaker tonight has some amazing insights to share with all of us." Margaret found her assigned table near the front of the room. She was seated with two other judges, a law professor, and three donors who gave money to support criminal justice research. The conversation at her table was lively and interesting. As they ate their salads, Margaret looked around the room. Everyone seemed excited about the evening's program. She picked up the event program from beside her plate and began reading through it. The program was nicely printed on thick paper. The front cover had a picture of the university's law building and the title, "Building a More Just Tomorrow and Evening Supporting Criminal Justice Reform." Inside were pages about the different research projects the university was working on. Margaret read about programs that studied how poverty affected legal outcomes. There were projects that looked at racial bias in sentencing. One program was training judges to recognize their own unconscious prejudices and make more fair decisions. This all sounds very progressive, Margaret thought to herself. She felt good about being part of this effort to improve justice. She turned the page and saw the evening's schedule. Cocktails at 6, dinner at 7, and then the keynote address at 8:30. The keynote speaker was listed as Dr. Marcus Thompson, Distinguished Professor of Criminology and Social Justice. Margaret read the name again. Marcus Thompson. That was not a very common name. She wondered if she had heard it before somewhere. Below the speaker's name was a short biography. Margaret began reading it while she ate her dinner. Dr. Marcus Thompson is a distinguished professor of criminology and social justice at State University. He earned his Ph.D. in sociology from Harvard University and his master's degree in criminal justice from Columbia University. Dr. Thompson's research focuses on judicial bias, systemic inequality in the courts, and the impact of socioeconomic assumptions on legal outcomes. Margaret paused in her reading. The name was starting to sound more familiar, though she could not place where she had heard it. Dr. Thompson has published over 40 academic papers in leading journals and has written 2 books on criminal justice reform. His work has been cited by the Supreme Court in 3 major cases dealing with equal treatment under the law. He has also served as a consultant to courts in 12 states, helping them develop better practices for fair sentencing. Margaret's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. This Dr. Thompson was clearly a very accomplished person. His research sounded exactly like the kind of work that could help judges like her do their jobs better. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Thompson brings a unique perspective to criminal justice issues through his personal experience working in various roles within the legal system. He believes that understanding justice requires seeing it from all angles, from the judge's bench to the courthouse floor. Margaret read this last line twice. Something about it made her feel a little uncomfortable, though she was not sure why. She turned the page and saw Dr. Thompson's photograph. Margaret's heart stopped. The man in the professional headshot was wearing a suit and tie. His smile was confident and intelligent. His eyes were kind but serious. But Margaret recognized him immediately. It was Marcus, the janitor from the courthouse. The man she had laughed at that morning. The man she had said was born to clean up after others. The man she had insulted in front of the court clerk. Margaret stared at the photograph for a long time. Her dinner suddenly tasted like nothing. Her mouth felt dry. She looked around the elegant ballroom at all the important people talking about justice and fairness, and realized what she had done. The man she had treated so rudely that morning was not just a janitor. He was one of the most respected researchers in criminal justice in the entire country. He had degrees from Harvard and Columbia. The Supreme Court had used his work to make important decisions. He was exactly the kind of expert that judges like her were supposed to learn from. "Are you all right, Margaret?" asked Judge Harrison, who was sitting next to her. "You look a little pale." Margaret tried to smile. "I am fine. Just reading about tonight's speaker. He sounds very impressive." "Oh, Marcus Thompson? He is brilliant," said Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the law professor at their table. "His research on how judges make assumptions about people based on their appearance or job is groundbreaking. It should be required reading for every judge in the country." Margaret felt sick to her stomach. Dr. Thompson's research was about exactly what she had done that morning. She had made assumptions about him based on his job. She had treated him badly because she thought he was not important. "I heard he takes a very hands-on approach to his research," added one of the donors. "He actually works regular jobs sometimes to understand how the justice system treats different types of people. It gives him insights that other professors do not have." Margaret's face got hot. Now she understood why Marcus had been mopping floors at the courthouse. It was not because he could not get a better job. It was because he was studying how people like her treated people like him, and she had failed his test completely. The dinner plates were being cleared away, and people were getting ready for the keynote address. Margaret wanted to leave. She wanted to go home and pretend this evening had never happened. But she could not leave now without looking strange. "Ladies and gentlemen," Patricia Vance said from the podium, "please welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Marcus Thompson." The room erupted in applause. Margaret clapped along with everyone else, but her hands felt heavy. She watched as Marcus walked to the podium, looking professional and confident in his dark suit. He was the same man who had been so polite to her that morning, even after she had been rude to him. The same man who had told her he hoped her day would get better. The same man whose feelings she had dismissed as unimportant. Now he was about to speak to a room full of judges and lawyers about bias in the justice system. And Margaret knew that everything he said would be a mirror showing her exactly who she really was. Dr. Marcus Thompson stood at the podium and looked out at the audience of judges, lawyers, professors, and donors. The ballroom was completely quiet. Everyone was waiting to hear what he had to say. Margaret sat frozen in her chair. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. She wanted to disappear, but she could not move. All around her, people looked interested and ready to learn. They had no idea what she had done that morning. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Marcus began. His voice was clear and confident. It was the same voice that had politely said, "Good morning, Your Honor," while she had been rude to him. "Tonight I want to talk about something that affects every single person who works in our justice system. I want to talk about the assumptions we make." Margaret's stomach felt sick. She knew this speech was going to be about her behavior, even if Marcus did not say her name. "Every day people walk into courthouses across America," Marcus continued. "They come seeking justice. They come hoping for fairness. But before they even speak, many of them are already being judged. Not for their actions, not for their words, but for how they look, how they dress, or what job they have." The audience listened carefully. Several people nodded their heads in agreement. Margaret tried to look interested, but she felt like everyone could see her guilt. "Let me share some statistics with you," Marcus said, clicking to his first slide. "Studies show that people dressed in expensive clothes receive lighter sentences than people dressed in cheap clothes for the exact same crimes. People with certain accents are seen as less trustworthy than people who speak in certain ways. People with certain jobs are treated as less intelligent than people with other jobs." Margaret looked at the numbers on the screen. They were shocking. The differences in how people were treated based on appearance were much bigger than she had ever imagined. "But these biases do not just hurt the people being judged," Marcus said. They hurt our entire justice system. When we make decisions based on assumptions instead of facts, we are not providing justice. We are providing prejudice dressed up as fairness. Judge Harrison leaned over to Margaret and whispered, "This is exactly what we need to hear. Too many judges think they are above these kinds of biases." Margaret nodded, but she felt terrible. She was one of those judges who thought she was above bias, but her behavior that morning proved she was not. "Now I know what some of you are thinking," Marcus said with a slight smile. "You are thinking, not me. I treat everyone fairly. I do not make assumptions. But research shows that even the most well-meaning people have unconscious biases. Even people who truly want to be fair can act unfairly without realizing it." Margaret felt a tiny bit of hope. Maybe Marcus was not talking specifically about her. Maybe he understood that she had not meant to be cruel. Maybe she was just guilty of unconscious bias like everyone else. But then Marcus continued, and her hope disappeared. "However," he said, his voice getting more serious, "there's a difference between unconscious bias and conscious disrespect. There is a difference between making an assumption without thinking and deliberately treating someone as less than human." The room was completely silent. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. "I want to tell you about something that happened to me this morning," Marcus said. "I was working at the courthouse downtown. Part of my research involves taking jobs where I can observe how the justice system treats people in different roles. Today I was working as a custodian." Margaret's hands started to shake. She gripped them together tighter. "A judge came into the building," Marcus continued. "She was clearly having a difficult morning. She was late, she was frustrated, and she accidentally spilled some coffee when she bumped into me while I was mopping the floor." Margaret wanted to run, but her legs would not move. Now accidents happen. I understood that she was stressed. I tried to be polite and helpful, but what happened next was not an accident. It was a choice. Marcus paused and looked around the room. His eyes seemed to find Margaret for just a moment, but then moved on. "This judge looked at me in my custodial uniform, and she made a decision about who I was. She decided I was careless. She decided I was probably uneducated. She decided I was someone who deserved to be talked down to and laughed at." Margaret felt like everyone in the room was staring at her, even though she knew they were not. She felt exposed and ashamed. She made comments about you people needing to be more careful. She wondered out loud whether people like me had even finished high school. She laughed about how some people are born to clean up after others and will never amount to anything more. Several people in the audience looked shocked and disgusted. Margaret heard someone at another table say, "How awful. What kind of person would say things like that?" "Now here is what this judge did not know," Marcus said, advancing to his next slide. "The person she was insulting has a PhD from Harvard University. He has written books that have influenced Supreme Court decisions. He has spent 15 years studying exactly the kind of behavior she was demonstrating." The audience murmured with surprise and anger. Margaret closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear. "But here is what is most important," Marcus continued. "It should not matter whether I have a PhD or whether I dropped out of high school. It should not matter whether I am a professor or whether cleaning floors is my full-time career. Every person deserves to be treated with basic human dignity and respect." The applause was loud and long. People stood up clapping enthusiastically. Margaret clapped too, because not clapping would have looked suspicious. But her applause was weak and hollow. "The judge I encountered today represents a problem that exists throughout our justice system," Marcus said when the applause died down. "When people in positions of power believe they are superior to others based on job titles or social status, they cannot provide true justice. Justice requires seeing every person as equally worthy of respect." Dr. Martinez at Margaret's table leaned over to Judge Harrison.
"Can you imagine behaving that way?"
"I hope someone reports that judge to the Judicial Conduct Board." Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. Could she be reported? Could she lose her job over this? "But I do not tell this story to shame anyone," Marcus continued, as if he had heard Margaret's thoughts. "I tell it because it illustrates how easy it is to fall into these patterns of thinking. The judge who treated me poorly probably considers herself a fair and just person. She probably believes she treats everyone equally. Margaret did consider herself fair. She had always thought she was a good judge who treated people equally. But now she was seeing herself clearly for the first time. The question is not whether we have biases, Marcus said. The question is what we do when we recognize our biases. Do we defend them? Do we deny them? Or do we work to change them? Marcus clicked to a news slide showing a photograph of the courthouse where Margaret worked. Every day, people walk into buildings like this one hoping for justice. They hope that the people making decisions about their lives will see them as human beings worthy of respect. That hope should not depend on their job, their clothes, their accent, or their education level. The audience was completely focused on every word Marcus said. Margaret realized that he was an excellent speaker. His research was solid, his examples were powerful, and his message was clear. He really was as brilliant as his biography suggested. So how do we create real change? Marcus asked. First, we must admit that bias exists. We cannot fix a problem we refuse to see. Second, we must educate ourselves about our own prejudices. Third, we must create systems that hold us accountable for treating all people fairly. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes explaining specific programs that courts could implement to reduce bias. He talked about training programs for judges, evaluation systems for fair treatment, and ways to measure whether justice was truly equal. Margaret found herself genuinely interested in his ideas, despite her personal embarrassment. His research was impressive and his solutions were practical. She could see how these programs might help judges like her avoid making the mistakes she had made. In conclusion, Marcus said, I want to return to the story I told you at the beginning. The judge who treated me poorly this morning had a choice. She could have chosen kindness over cruelty, respect over ridicule, curiosity over assumption. She chose poorly. But it is not too late for her to choose differently in the future. Marcus looked directly at Margaret as he said these last words. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and Margaret saw something unexpected in his expression. It was not anger or hatred. It was not triumph or revenge. It was something like compassion, mixed with challenge. We all have the power to choose how we treat others, Marcus concluded. Let us choose to build a justice system that reflects the best of who we can be, not the worst of who we have been. The standing ovation was immediate and enthusiastic. People clapped, cheered, and called out their agreement. Margaret stood and clapped too, but she felt like she was watching everything from far away. As the applause continued, Marcus stepped away from the podium. He had delivered a powerful message that would be remembered by everyone in the room. But Margaret knew that for her, this speech was not just about criminal justice reform. After the speech ended, people began moving around the ballroom again. Some went to the bar for drinks. Others gathered in small groups to discuss what they had heard. Margaret sat in her chair, watching everyone else talk excitedly about Dr. Thompson's presentation. She felt completely alone in the crowded room. That was incredible, said Dr. Martinez, turning to face the others at their table. Dr. Thompson's research is exactly what our legal system needs. His personal example today just proves how real these problems are. Judge Harrison nodded enthusiastically. I have read his books, but hearing him speak in person is different. You can feel his passion for justice. And that story about the rude judge this morning, can you believe someone would act that way? Margaret tried to smile and nod, but her face felt stiff. Yes, it was very eye-opening, she managed to say. I wonder which courthouse that happened at, said one of the donors, and I wonder if anyone else witnessed it. That kind of behavior should not be tolerated from anyone, especially a judge. Margaret's mouth felt dry. I am sure it was just a misunderstanding, she said quietly. Maybe the judge was having a bad day. Dr. Martinez looked surprised. Margaret, you heard the same speech we did. That was not a misunderstanding. That was deliberate disrespect and prejudice. There is no excuse for treating another human being that way. I agree completely, said Judge Harrison. A bad day does not give anyone the right to be cruel to others. If I knew which judge did that, I would report them myself. Margaret excused herself and walked toward the ladies' room. She needed a few minutes alone to think. The hallway was quieter than the ballroom, and she could breathe a little better. But as she walked down the hall, she heard voices coming from a small conference room. The door was slightly open, and she could see several people inside talking with Dr. Thompson. Margaret slowed down to listen, even though she knew she should not. Marcus, that was a powerful speech, said a woman's voice that Margaret recognized as belonging to Dr. Patricia Vance, the law school dean. But I have to ask, did that really happen this morning? The story about the judge? Every word of it, Marcus replied. I have been working at that courthouse for 2 months now as part of my research. Most of the people there treat me with respect, but today was different. Have you experienced this kind of treatment before? Asked another voice. Unfortunately, yes, Marcus said. This is why I do this work. I take jobs in different places to see how people react to me based on what they think I am versus who I really am. The results are always educational but not always pleasant. Margaret leaned closer to the door, feeling guilty but unable to stop listening. But why do you put yourself through that? Asked Dr. Vance. You are a respected professor. You do not need to work as a janitor. Marcus was quiet for a moment before answering. Several reasons. First, I need the extra money. My mother has been sick for 3 years and her medical bills are expensive. Even with insurance, the costs add up. My professor's salary is good, but it is not enough to cover everything. Margaret felt a stab of guilt. She had assumed Marcus was working as a janitor because he could not do anything else. She had never considered that he might have personal reasons for needing extra income. Second, Marcus continued, doing this work gives me insights I could never get just by reading books or conducting interviews. When you are treated as invisible or unimportant, you see how our society really works. You see who gets respect and who does not. You see how power operates in everyday interactions. That must be emotionally difficult, said another person in the room. It is, Marcus admitted, but it is also important. How can I teach about inequality if I do not experience it myself? How can I write about bias if I stay safely in my university office? My research has to be based on real experience, not just theory. Margaret heard footsteps approaching the hallway and quickly moved away from the door. She did not want to be caught listening to a private conversation. She continued to the ladies' room, but her mind was spinning with what she had learned. Marcus was not just a brilliant professor doing interesting research. He was a son caring for his sick mother. He was a scholar who put himself in difficult situations to better understand the world. He was a person with real feelings and real struggles, just like everyone else. And she had treated him like he was nothing. When Margaret returned to the ballroom, the formal program was over, but many people were still there talking. She saw Marcus across the room, surrounded by admirers. Judges, lawyers, and professors were asking him questions about his research and complimenting his speech. Margaret wanted to approach him, but she did not know what to say. How do you apologize to someone you humiliated? How do you explain behavior that has no good explanation? Instead, she found herself listening to conversations around the room. Everyone was talking about Marcus and his work. I had no idea the bias in our courts was so systematic, she heard one judge say. His research really opened my eyes. The way he combines personal experience with academic study is brilliant, said a law professor. His work is going to change how we train judges and lawyers. Did you know he has consulted with courts in 12 different states? Asked someone else. His recommendations have led to real improvements in how people are treated in the legal system. Margaret learned more about Marcus in those conversations than she had ever bothered to learn that morning. She found out that his first book had won a national award for criminal justice research. His second book was being used as a textbook in law schools across the country. She learned that he regularly spoke at conferences around the world. Judges and legal scholars sought his advice on how to make their courts more fair and just. He had been invited to speak at the Supreme Court about bias in sentencing. She also learned about his background. Marcus had grown up in a poor neighborhood where many young men ended up in prison. He had seen how the justice system treated people from his community differently than it treated wealthy people. That experience had motivated him to study law and work for change. He could have just become successful and forgotten about where he came from, Margaret heard someone say. But instead, he has dedicated his career to helping others. That takes real character. Margaret thought about her own background. She had grown up in a comfortable, middle-class family. Her father was a lawyer and her mother was a teacher. She had never worried about money, or wondered if she would be treated fairly by the justice system. Maybe that was why she had been so quick to judge Marcus based on his job. She had never needed to think about how differently people were treated based on their appearance or their work. As the evening wound down, Margaret watched Marcus say goodbye to various people. He thanked them for coming, answered their questions, and promised to send them copies of his research papers. He was gracious and professional with everyone. Margaret noticed that several judges asked Marcus for his business card. They wanted to invite him to speak at their courts or to consult with them about improving their practices. The judge who had insulted him that morning was probably the only person in the room who had not learned something valuable from him. Dr. Vance approached Margaret as she was getting ready to leave. I hope you found tonight's program useful, Margaret. Dr. Thompson's work is really groundbreaking. Yes, very informative, Margaret replied, trying to sound normal. His research seems very thorough. It is. And his personal commitment to justice is inspiring. Did you know he volunteers at legal aid clinics in his spare time? He helps people who cannot afford lawyers navigate the court system. Even with his busy schedule, he makes time to give back to the community. Margaret did not know that. Another piece of information that made her feel worse about her behavior. He sounds like a remarkable person, Margaret said, and she meant it. He is. We are lucky to have him on our faculty. I just wish more people in the legal system understood the importance of his work. As Margaret drove home that night, she could not stop thinking about everything she had learned. Marcus Thompson was not just the custodian she had been rude to. He was a distinguished scholar, a caring son, a dedicated teacher, and a person working to make the world more just and fair. And she had treated him like he was worthless. The worst part was that Marcus had handled her cruelty with such dignity and grace. He had not argued with her or tried to defend himself. He had simply continued doing his job with professionalism and respect. Even in his speech that night, he had not mentioned her name or tried to embarrass her publicly. He had used their encounter as a teaching moment, not as a weapon for revenge. Margaret realized that Marcus Thompson was everything a person should be: intelligent, compassionate, hardworking, and committed to making things better for others. And she had shown herself to be the opposite: prejudiced, cruel, and quick to judge others based on superficial things. As she pulled into her driveway, Margaret knew that her comfortable assumptions about herself had been completely shattered. She had always thought of herself as a good person, a fair judge, and someone who treated others with respect. Tonight, she had learned that she was none of those things, and the question now was what she was going to do about it. Margaret did not sleep well that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus Thompson's face. Sometimes she saw him as he had looked that morning, quiet and respectful while she was being cruel. Sometimes she saw him as he had looked during his speech, confident and dignified while telling her story to a room full of important people. She kept thinking about the way he had said, "Good morning, Your Honor," after she had been rude to him. His voice had been so polite, so professional. He had shown her more respect than she had shown him, even though she had not deserved it. Margaret got up early and made coffee, but it tasted bitter. Everything felt different now. Her expensive house, her important job, her comfortable life, none of it seemed to matter as much as it had yesterday. She knew she had to do something. She could not just pretend that last night had not happened. She could not go back to work and act like everything was normal. But what could she do? How do you fix something like this? Margaret thought about calling Marcus at the university, but she did not know what to say on the phone. She thought about writing him a letter, but words on paper seemed too easy, too impersonal. She needed to face him directly, but she was also terrified of facing him. What if he was angry? What if he humiliated her the way she had humiliated him? What if he reported her behavior to the Judicial Conduct Board? Margaret spent most of Wednesday trying to work normally, but she could not concentrate. During court sessions, she found herself looking at the people in her courtroom differently. She noticed the defendants who were wearing old clothes or looking nervous. She wondered if she had been treating them fairly, or if she had been making assumptions about them based on how they looked. She also found herself paying more attention to the courthouse staff. The security guards, the clerks, the maintenance workers. How many times had she walked past them without really seeing them? How many times had she treated them as invisible? By Thursday morning, Margaret knew she had to talk to Marcus. She could not keep carrying this guilt and shame around with her. She had to at least try to apologize, even if he did not want to hear it. Margaret arrived at the courthouse early and looked for Marcus. She found him in a supply closet on the 3rd floor, organizing cleaning supplies. He was wearing his blue uniform and working quietly, just like always. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work. He moved efficiently, checking supplies and making notes on a clipboard. He looked completely focused on his job. "Excuse me," Margaret said quietly. Marcus looked up and saw her standing there. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Margaret could see recognition in his eyes, but his expression did not change. "Good morning, Your Honor," Marcus said politely. "Can I help you with something?" The same respectful tone, the same professional manner. Even after everything that had happened, he was still treating her with more courtesy than she deserved. I was at the university dinner on Tuesday night, Margaret said. She felt foolish stating something so obvious. I see, Marcus said. He put down his clipboard and gave her his full attention, but he did not look surprised. I heard your speech, Margaret continued. It was very informative. Marcus nodded. I am glad you found it useful. Criminal justice reform is important work. Margaret realized this was going to be harder than she had thought. Marcus was being perfectly polite, but he was not making it easy for her. She was going to have to say exactly what she meant. Dr. Thompson, Margaret said, using his title for the first time, I owe you an apology. Marcus waited for her to continue. He did not say that's okay or don't worry about it the way some people might have. He just waited to hear what she would say. The way I treated you on Tuesday morning was wrong, Margaret said. I was rude and disrespectful. I made assumptions about you that were completely unfair. I am sorry. Marcus listened carefully to her words. I appreciate you saying that, Your Honor. Apologies are not always easy to give. Margaret felt a little relieved, but she could tell that Marcus was not finished talking. But I have to ask you something, Marcus continued. Are you apologizing because of what I said in my speech? Are you sorry because you found out I am a professor? Or are you sorry because you treated another human being poorly? The question hit Margaret like a punch. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. She had to think about it honestly. Was she apologizing because she was embarrassed that she had insulted an important person? Or was she apologizing because she had been cruel to another human being? Margaret started, then stopped. She wanted to give the right answer, but she needed to give the honest answer. I think both. I am embarrassed that I treated you badly when you are clearly an accomplished person. But I am also ashamed that I was cruel to you regardless of who you are. Marcus nodded slowly. That is an honest answer. Many people would not have admitted the first part. Margaret felt a little better, but Marcus was not done. Your Honor, can I tell you something? Marcus asked. This was not the first time someone has treated me the way you did on Tuesday. It happens regularly when I work these jobs. The difference is that most people never have to face what they have done. Margaret felt sick again. How often does this happen? Often enough, Marcus said sadly. People see the uniform and they make decisions about who I am and what I am worth. They talk to me like I am stupid or invisible. They act like their time and their problems are more important than mine. That must be very painful, Margaret said, and she meant it. It is, but it is also educational. It shows me how our society really works. It shows me what many people experience every day when they walk into courtrooms and face judges who have already decided what kind of person they are. Margaret understood what he meant. She thought about all the defendants who had appeared in her court over the years. How many of them had she judged based on their clothes, their jobs, or their appearance before they even spoke? Dr. Thompson, Margaret said, I know I cannot take back what I did, but I want you to know that I have learned something from this experience. I am going to try to do better. Marcus studied her face carefully. What does doing better mean to you, Your Honor? Another difficult question. Margaret realized that saying she would try to do better was easy. Actually changing her behavior would be much harder. I think it means paying attention to my own biases, Margaret said slowly. It means treating every person with respect, regardless of their job or how they look. It means remembering that everyone has dignity, even if society does not always recognize it. Those are good goals, Marcus said, but changing behavior is harder than changing intentions. Bias runs deep. It takes constant work to overcome it. Margaret nodded. You are right. I have been a judge for 8 years and I thought I was fair to everyone. But I realize now that I have probably made assumptions about people without even knowing it. We all have, Marcus said. The important thing is what we do when we recognize our biases. Do we defend them or do we work to change them? Margaret remembered him saying almost the same thing during his speech. I want to change them, but I do not know how. Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, Your Honor, may I make a suggestion? Please, Margaret said. Read my research, Marcus said. Not because you have to, but because you want to understand. Learn about how bias affects the justice system. Then think about your own courtroom practices. Are there changes you could make that would ensure everyone is treated fairly? Margaret felt hopeful for the first time since Tuesday morning. I will do that. I promise, and Your Honor, Marcus added. The next time you see someone in a uniform or working at a job that society does not value highly, Remember that you do not know their story. You do not know their education, their struggles, their dreams, or their worth as a human being. All you know is what they look like at that moment. Margaret nodded. I will remember that. Marcus picked up his clipboard again, signaling that their conversation was coming to an end. I need to finish my work here, Your Honor, but I am glad we had this talk. So am I, Margaret said. And Dr. Thompson? Thank you for being so gracious about this. You would have had every right to be angry with me. Marcus smiled slightly, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. Anger would not change anything, Your Honor, but understanding might. As Margaret walked away from the supply closet, she felt different than she had in days. The conversation had been difficult and uncomfortable, but it had also been necessary. She still felt ashamed of her behavior, but now she also felt something else. Hope. Hope that she could learn from this experience. Hope that she could become a better judge and a better person. Hope that she could earn the respect that Marcus had shown her, even when she had not deserved it. But she also knew that this conversation was just the beginning. The real work, changing her attitudes and behaviors, was going to take much more time and effort. Margaret was ready to do that work. She owed it to Marcus, to everyone who appeared in her courtroom, and to herself. The next morning, Margaret woke up feeling like she had accomplished something important by talking to Marcus. She had apologized, he had been gracious, and they had ended their conversation on a hopeful note. She felt like maybe the worst part was behind her. But as Margaret got ready for work, she realized that her feelings were more complicated than relief. Yes, she felt better about apologizing, but she also felt like something was still unfinished. The conversation had been too neat, too polite, too easy. Marcus had accepted her apology with dignity, but Margaret could tell that her words had not really changed anything between them. He had been professional and kind, but there had been distance in his manner, like he was being polite to a stranger, not forgiving someone who had hurt him. Margaret spent the day thinking about their conversation. She replayed it in her mind over and over, analyzing every word. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that her apology had been incomplete. She had said she was sorry for being rude and making assumptions. But she had not really explained why she had acted that way. She had not taken full responsibility for the hurt she had caused, and she had not really shown Marcus that she understood the deeper problem with her behavior. Margaret also realized that she had made the conversation partly about herself. She had talked about feeling embarrassed and wanting to do better, but she had not focused enough on how her actions had affected Marcus. By Friday afternoon, Margaret decided she needed to talk to Marcus again. This time she wanted to give him a real apology, one that focused on his experience, not on making herself feel better. Margaret found Marcus in the courthouse basement, emptying trash cans in a storage area. The basement was dimly lit and smelled like cleaning supplies. It was not a pleasant place to work, but Marcus was doing his job carefully and thoroughly, just like always. Dr. Thompson, Margaret called out as she approached. Marcus looked up from his work. He seemed surprised to see her again so soon. Good afternoon, Your Honor. Is there something I can help you with? Margaret took a deep breath. I wanted to talk to you again about Tuesday morning. I do not think my apology yesterday was adequate. Marcus set down the trash bag he was holding. Your Honor, you already apologized. You do not need to keep bringing this up. But I do, Margaret said, because I realized that yesterday I was still making this about me. I was focused on how embarrassed I felt and how I wanted to make myself feel better. I was not really thinking about how my behavior affected you. Marcus looked at her carefully but did not say anything. I want you to know that I understand now what I really did on Tuesday morning, Margaret continued. I did not just make a mistake or have a bad day. I deliberately chose to treat you as less than human. I chose to be cruel to someone who was being kind to me. I chose to use my position of power to make you feel small. Margaret's voice was getting stronger as she spoke. She had been thinking about these words for hours, and she needed Marcus to hear them. I made assumptions about your intelligence, your worth, and your future based on nothing but your job and your appearance, she said. That was not an accident. That was prejudice. And prejudice from someone in my position is not just wrong, it is dangerous. Marcus listened to every word, but his expression was hard to read. I also want you to know, Margaret said, that when I found out you were a professor, my first feeling was not shame for how I had treated you. My first feeling was fear that I would get in trouble. I was worried about my reputation, not about the pain I had caused you. That shows you exactly what kind of person I was on Tuesday morning. This admission was harder for Margaret to make, but she knew it was important. Marcus needed to hear the whole truth about her motivations, not just the parts that made her look better. Your Honor, Marcus said quietly, why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know the truth about what happened and why it happened, Margaret replied. And because I need to face the truth about myself. I spent 8 years thinking I was a fair and just judge, but fair and just people do not treat others the way I treated you. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Your Honor, I appreciate your honesty, but I have to ask, what do you want from me? Do you want me to tell you that it is okay? Do you want me to say that we are friends now? Do you want me to make you feel better about what happened? The questions were asked without anger, but they were direct and challenging. Margaret realized that Marcus was not going to make this easy for her, and he should not have to. I do not want anything from you, Margaret said. You have already given me more than I deserved by listening to me and being kind when I was cruel. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did, and I am committed to making sure it never happens again. How? Marcus asked. How are you going to make sure it never happens again? Margaret had been ready for this question. I have started reading your research papers. I want to understand how bias affects the justice system. I am also going to attend training sessions on unconscious bias, and I'm going to change how I run my courtroom to make sure everyone is treated with equal respect. Marcus nodded slowly. Those are good steps. But Your Honor, can I be completely honest with you about something? Please, Var, Margaret said. What happened on Tuesday morning was not really about unconscious bias, Marcus said. Unconscious bias is when you make assumptions without realizing it. But what you did was conscious. You made a choice to be mean to someone you saw as beneath you. That is a different problem, and it requires a different solution. Margaret felt like she had been slapped. Marcus was right, and she knew it. She had not unconsciously treated him badly. She had deliberately chosen to be cruel. You are right, Margaret said quietly. I did make a conscious choice to treat you poorly. I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway. That is worse than unconscious bias. It is worse, Marcus agreed. But it is also more fixable, because conscious choices can be changed. The question is whether you are willing to do the hard work of changing not just your behavior, but your heart. Margaret was not sure what Marcus meant by changing her heart, but she knew it was important. What does that mean? She asked. It means examining why you felt like you had the right to treat me that way, Marcus said. It means asking yourself what you really believe about people who work in service jobs. It means thinking about where those beliefs came from and whether they are true. Margaret felt uncomfortable, but she knew Marcus was pushing her towards something important. It also means recognizing that respect and dignity are not things people have to earn from you, Marcus continued. They are things every person deserves simply because they are human. My education, my job title, my accomplishments, none of those things make me worthy of respect. I was worthy of respect on Tuesday morning when you thought I was just a janitor. These words hit Margaret hard. She realized that even in her apologies, she had been focusing on Marcus's impressive credentials. She had been treating him better because she learned he was a professor, not because she understood that he deserved respect no matter what his job was. You are right, Margaret said. I have been doing it again, haven't I? Even in my apologies, I have been talking about how accomplished you are, like that is what makes my behavior wrong. But you deserved respect on Tuesday morning regardless of your education or your job. Exactly, Marcus said. And so does every person who comes into your courtroom. The defendant wearing old clothes deserves the same respect as the lawyer wearing an expensive suit. The person who dropped out of high school deserves the same courtesy as the person with a college degree. Margaret felt like she was finally beginning to understand what Marcus had been trying to teach her. This was not just about apologizing for one incident. This was about changing her entire approach to how she treated other people. Dr. Thompson, Margaret said, I know I have a lot of work to do on myself, and I know that my apologies do not undo the hurt I caused you. But I want you to know that this conversation has been more valuable to me than any law school class or judicial training I ever attended. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Your Honor, I believe you are sincere about wanting to change. But change is not a one-time decision. It is a daily choice. Every time you interact with another person, you will have to choose between respect and disrespect. between kindness and cruelty, between seeing someone as human or as less than human. I understand, Margaret said, and I am committed to making the right choice every time. I hope you are, Marcus said, because the people in your courtroom are counting on you to see their humanity, not just their circumstances. As Margaret walked away from that second conversation, she felt different than she had after the first one. The first conversation had made her feel better. This one had made her think harder. It had challenged her in ways that were uncomfortable but necessary. Margaret realized that Marcus had given her a gift by being so direct and honest with her. He could have just accepted her first apology and let her feel good about herself. Instead, he had pushed her to confront the deeper issues with her attitudes and behavior. Now the real work could begin. 3 months later, Judge Margaret Whitmore sat in her courtroom preparing for the morning session. But something was different about how she prepared now. Instead of just reading case files, she took time to think about each person who would appear before her that day. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, a defendant in a shoplifting case who worked 2 jobs to support her children. There was Mr. Jackson, a young man charged with driving without a license who could not afford car insurance. There was Ms. Kim, a defendant in a traffic case who spoke English as a second language. Margaret had learned that respect and dignity were not privileges to be earned, but rights that belonged to every human being. She had learned that her position as a judge gave her power, and that power came with the responsibility to use it fairly and justly. Most importantly, Margaret had learned that changing behavior was not enough. Real change required examining the beliefs and attitudes that drove that behavior. It required constant self-reflection and a willingness to be uncomfortable when confronting difficult truths about oneself. Over the following months, Margaret continued to grow and change. She joined a judicial committee focused on eliminating bias in the courts. She volunteered to mentor new judges, sharing her own story of learning to recognize and overcome prejudice. Margaret also began speaking at legal conferences about the importance of treating all people with respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. Her presentations were powerful because she spoke from personal experience, admitting her mistakes and describing her journey toward becoming a better judge in person. 1 year after her encounter with Marcus, Margaret received a letter that surprised her. It was from a defendant who had appeared in her court several months earlier, a young woman charged with a minor drug offense who had been struggling with addiction. The letter thanked Margaret for treating her with kindness and respect during a very difficult time in her life. The woman wrote that Margaret's compassionate approach had motivated her to get clean and turn her life around. She was now 6 months sober and working full-time while attending community college. Margaret kept that letter on her desk as a reminder of why her transformation mattered. Her behavior in the courtroom affected real people with real lives. When she treated people with dignity, it made a difference in their lives and in their willingness to trust the justice system. Margaret also stayed in touch with Marcus's research. She read his new papers and attended his lectures when he spoke at legal conferences. Their relationship had evolved into a professional friendship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. At one conference, Margaret listened as Marcus presented research showing that courts where judges received bias training had measurably better outcomes for defendants from all backgrounds. Sentences were more consistent, people reported feeling more fairly treated, and there were fewer appeals based on claims of judicial bias. After his presentation, Margaret approached Marcus during the break. "Dr. Thompson, your research continues to be groundbreaking," she said. "I hope you know how much impact your work is having on the justice system." Marcus smiled. "Thank you, Your Honor. But you know the research only matters if people like you are willing to put it into practice. Real change happens one judge, one courtroom, one decision at a time." Margaret nodded. "I think about that every day when I go to work. Every person who appears before me deserves to be treated with the same respect I would want for myself or my family." "That is exactly right," Marcus said. "When we remember that every defendant is someone's child, parent, or sibling, it becomes much harder to treat them as less than human." As Margaret drove home from the conference that evening, she thought about how different her life had become. The change had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had also been deeply rewarding. She felt like she was finally living up to the oath she had taken as a judge to provide equal justice under law. Margaret also thought about the broader impact of her transformation. Other judges had told her that her example had inspired them to examine their own biases and make changes in their courtrooms. Court staff had mentioned that her respectful treatment of everyone in the courthouse had created a more positive work environment for everyone. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret had learned that personal growth was an ongoing process, not a one-time event. Every day brought new opportunities to choose between respect and disrespect, between fairness and prejudice, between seeing people as human beings or as stereotypes. Marcus Thompson had given her the tools and motivation to make better choices, but the daily work of applying those lessons was hers alone, and she was committed to continuing that work for the rest of her career and her life. The encounter that had begun with cruelty and prejudice had become a story of growth, redemption, and hope. It proved that even deeply ingrained biases could be overcome by people who were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and do the hard work of change. Margaret's story became part of Marcus's research. Though he never used her name or identified her in his publications, their encounter became one example among many of how bias operates in the justice system, but also of how people can learn and grow when given the opportunity. Years later, Margaret would still remember that rainy Tuesday morning as one of the most important days of her life. Not because of what she had done wrong, but because of what she had learned about herself and about the person she wanted to become. The courthouse janitor had taught the judge lessons that no law school or legal training had ever provided. He had shown her that true wisdom and dignity had nothing to do with job titles or social status, and everything to do with how we treat one another as human beings. And that lesson changed everything. To see these people as individuals with their own stories, struggles, and dignity. She no longer made quick judgments based on how they looked or what they wore to court. The changes in Margaret's courtroom were noticeable to everyone who worked there. Sarah Chen, the court clerk, had watched Margaret transform from a judge who barely noticed courthouse staff to someone who learned everyone's names and asked about their families. "Good morning, James," Margaret said to the security guard as she entered the courtroom. "How is your daughter doing in college?" "She is doing great, Your Honor," James replied with a smile. "Thank you for asking. She made the dean's list last semester." "That is wonderful," Margaret said genuinely. "You must be very proud." These small interactions had become important to Margaret. She realized that for years, she had walked through the courthouse treating most people as invisible. Now she made an effort to acknowledge everyone with respect and kindness. Margaret had also made significant changes to how she conducted court sessions. She spoke more slowly and clearly, especially when defendants did not have lawyers. She explained legal procedures in simple language. She made sure everyone understood what was happening and why. When people appeared before her who seemed nervous or confused, Margaret took extra time to put them at ease. She remembered Marcus's words about how people came to court hoping for justice, and she wanted everyone to feel that they were being treated fairly. Margaret had kept her promise to read Marcus's research. She had read both of his books and dozens of his academic papers. The research was eye-opening and sometimes painful to read, because she recognized her own past behavior in many of the examples he described. She had also attended 3 training sessions on unconscious bias and fair treatment in the courtroom. At one of these sessions, she had shared her own story about learning to recognize her prejudices. It was difficult to admit her mistakes publicly, but she felt it was important to be honest about her journey. Other judges had approached Margaret after her presentation to share their own experiences with bias. Several admitted that they had caught themselves making assumptions about people based on appearance or background. Margaret's willingness to discuss her mistakes had encouraged others to examine their own behavior. Margaret had also changed her routine at the courthouse. Instead of rushing from her car to her office every morning, she made time to walk through the building and greet the people who worked there. She had conversations with security guards, maintenance staff, clerks, and other employees she had previously ignored. From these conversations, Margaret learned amazing things about the people around her. The security guard James was putting his daughter through college while supporting his elderly mother. Maria, who cleaned the offices, was studying for her citizenship test and dreamed of becoming a paralegal. David, who worked in maintenance, was a veteran who had served 3 tours overseas. Each of these people had rich, complicated lives full of challenges, dreams, and accomplishments. Margaret felt ashamed that she had worked in the same building with them for years. without knowing anything about them as human beings. One morning in late spring, Margaret was walking through the courthouse lobby when she saw Marcus mopping the floors near the entrance. It was the same spot where they had first encountered each other 6 months earlier. Margaret approached him, but this time her manner was completely different. "Good morning, Dr. Thompson," she said respectfully. "How are you today?" Marcus looked up and smiled.